please introduce Stuart Hameroff, professor at the University of Arizona, active in the Center for Consciousness Studies. So Stuart, you are on the cutting edge of quantum physics and consciousness and the intersection of those two.
Yes, Greg, I think quantum physics is the key to consciousness. You know, going back to the Greeks, there's been this controversy between whether the brain produces consciousness or some part of consciousness is out in the universe that we access. And quantum physics allows us to sort of bridge that gap and actually favors being able to access parts of consciousness or the essential features of consciousness which are present in the universe by working through the brain.
Are you saying that we are accessing something that pre-exists and we're basically just a conduit for it then, or do we have a say?
Well, it's not quite that simple. There are basically two approaches to the so-called hard problem of consciousness, namely the hard problem being why we have experience, why we have flavors, tastes, emotions, feelings, how we're different from robots or zombies, why we have an inner life. And the two approaches are basically emergence and some kind of fundamental approach. Emergence is the idea that conscious experience emerges at sort of a high level of complexity. The brain, like many other systems, being sort of a hierarchy, and if you get complex enough up that hierarchy, voila, some new property emerges, like a storm, for example, a hurricane or a tornado is a pattern that emerges from simple elements, gas molecules, air molecules, working together to make a funnel cloud, for example, or the great red spot of Jupiter, or a candle flame is an emergent property, or the property of wetness from water is an emergent property. So many people think that consciousness emerges as a new novel property at a high level of complexity in this hierarchical system that we call the brain. The problem with that, I think, is that none of these other emergent phenomena are conscious. They don't have conscious experience. Moreover, there's no real prediction at what level of complexity consciousness might occur in the brain. And if that were the case, computers should be conscious already or should soon be. So for that reason, plus the fact that that would take away any possibility of free will, it also wouldn't give us this property of binding, how we bind everything together into one sense of self or unity of consciousness, and how we transition from the preconscious or subconscious to consciousness itself. These problems, I think, suggest that there's something more to consciousness than being an emergent property of computation. The brain is more than a simple classical computer.
When you say that computers would be conscious by now or soon, does that mean that they're doing as many computations as our brain is doing right now?
Well,
or will be soon?
Well, they will be within the next 20 years or so. And people make these predictions that when the brain reaches a certain level of computations equivalent to the brain, it should be conscious. But of course, then they'll hedge and say, well, no, it's not organized the same. They'll keep pushing the boundary back. But the first problem with that is that AI people, artificial intelligence people who make these predictions, assume that the brain works along the lines of a computer, in that the neurons of the brain and their connections, the synapses, are the fundamental units. So, for example, we have roughly 10 billion neurons with 1,000 connections each, or 10,000 switches to other neurons, which gives us about 10 to the 15th operations per second, with each neuron operating as a fundamental unit. The problem with that is that each neuron is much, much more complex than a simple switch. For example, consider a single cell like a paramecium, a single cell organism. It swims around, it finds food, it learns. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes. And if you do it again, it gets out quicker and quicker each time, so it can learn, it can find mates, it has a sex life, it does all kinds of things. It doesn't have any synapses whatsoever. It's just one cell.
And yet it's conscious.
I'm not sure it's conscious or not. That's a little bit, but it's certainly intelligent, and it does complex things without any synapses.
All right.
So if a paramecium, one cell, can do all those things, why should we think that a neuron is just a simple on-off switch, or that a synapse is just a simple on-off switch? The capacity of a neuron is much greater than that. If we go back to the paramecium, how does it do that? It uses its internal structure, its cytoskeleton, what seems like the structural support, but which is also the nervous system within each cell. The cytoskeleton comprised of microtubules mainly, which are these hollow cylindrical polymers that are seemingly perfectly designed to be information processing devices at the molecular level, a scale below that of neurons. They are the nervous system within each cell, the nervous system within each neuron, if you will. So these proteins, they're made of proteins, switch much faster than neurons. There's many, many more of them. Well, there's like 10 million within each cell, for example, switching in the nanosecond. So if we think of processing going down to that level, there's as much processing in one neuron at that level as there is in the whole brain, according to these AI-type estimates. So if we think that information processing in the brain goes down to the level of the microtubules, for example, we've increased the information capacity from 10 to the 15th roughly to 10 to the 27th.
Right, we're doubling.
Almost squaring it, yeah.
Exactly, okay.
So that pushes the goal way farther for the AI people. The problem is that even if that were the case, even if we're doing 10 to the 27th operations per second, even if the microtubules are the fundamental computers of consciousness, that still doesn't tell us why we have experience, why we have an inner life, why we have emotions, feeling, what philosophers call qualia. That's just more reductionism, more computation, but doesn't solve the problem, nor does it solve the other problems like binding, transition from preconscious processing to consciousness, the problem of free will, and so forth. And actually, I worked on the idea that microtubules inside neurons and other cells were information processors, and for almost 20 years, suggesting that to understand consciousness, to understand the brain, we needed to go inside each neuron to this level to consider all this information processing. And yet, people would say, okay, maybe you're right, so what? How does that solve the hard problem, as it's now known, of consciousness? How do you explain conscious experience from just further reductionism? And I had to admit that they were right. Even if the capacity of the brain were squared, it still didn't tell us why we had consciousness. Because the same arguments against emergence that I mentioned before still held. So at that point, about 1990, I read a book by Roger Penrose, the Oxford mathematical physicist, called The Emperor's New Mind. And The Emperor's New Mind was kind of a challenge to artificial intelligence, AI being kind of the computer industrial complex pushing the idea that larger and larger computers will attain consciousness. And Roger's book was based on the idea that that our minds, our conscious minds, do something that is beyond the realm of regular computation. He called it non-computable. And basically it was the idea that we do things that we know things other than through algorithms, other than through things that a computer can do. And it's through Gödel's theorem, and it's mathematical and philosophical. And to be honest, I didn't really understand all those arguments. But my gut level was that he was right. He argued that to explain consciousness, to explain how we can have this non-computability, which is really another word for free will, or along the lines of free will, or going in the direction of free will. Because if the brain is just a computer, everything is deterministic. We're just reacting to things in our environment.
Which means we should be completely predictable.
Completely
in the same
predictable.
way a computer is.
Correct.
Or
maybe with some randomness, but
right.
but
not the amount of randomness that we.
Well, certainly no free will, and we would be, as the philosopher Huxley said, merely helpless spectators. We would be epiphenomena, just along for the ride. We wouldn't be in control of anything. We would just be, well, epiphenomena, just going along with our actions and observing basically, without really having a say in what was going on. We might think we did, but it was an illusion. So Roger's idea was that the only thing in nature that can give us this non-computable element was a quantum mechanism, specifically a quantum gravity mechanism. And this seems so tangential to the idea of what's going on in the brain that most people really couldn't buy it. And it's a difficult concept, but to me, intuitively, there was something to it. Because what he said was, well, he likened the brain to a quantum computer. And that brings us into the world of quantum theory, which is a very difficult subject. In fact, Richard Feynman once said that anyone who claims to understand quantum theory is either lying or crazy, because it's so bizarre. For example, if you go down to the quantum realm, like small, like down, say, to the level of atoms, and it may be larger, but let's just talk about atoms, subatomic particles, things are completely different than they are in our classical world where things are firm and real and in one place, because at the quantum level, things can be in multiple places at the same time. Particles can be smeared out and act like waves. Things can be interconnected even over great distances. Time is smeared out. Everything is kind of different at that level. The boundary between this quantum world and the classical world, the Newtonian world in which we live, is unclear. It's called, some people call it the collapse of the wave function, because below that level, in the quantum world, things are governed by the quantum wave function. Above it, they're governed by Newtonian physics, classical, that we can understand. So this boundary is very unclear. And it was exemplified, the problem, for example, of superposition, of things being in multiple states at once. Quantum superposition means that things are superposed in two or more different places or states at the same time. So Erwin Schrödinger in 1937, one of the pioneers of quantum theory, came up with a thought experiment to demonstrate how bizarre and seemingly ridiculous this situation was. He said, we know that something small like a photon or an electron could be in superposition. If we send a photon through a half-silvered mirror with a 50% probability that it will go through and a 50% probability that it will be reflected, quantum theory tells us that the photon will actually both go through and not go through. So if we have that photon, if it takes one path, say reflected, strike a vial of poison, and there's a cat inside a box. Schrödinger said that quantum theory would predict that since the photon both went through and did not go through, the poison would both be released and not be released, and the cat would be both dead and alive. In other words, the quantum superposition would be amplified to apply to the cat. And there was nothing in quantum theory or in physics whatsoever that would preclude that possibility. The only thing that seemed to occur would be that if quantum superposition was observed by a conscious observer, then it would collapse to either dead or alive, one or zero, one or the other. And so Schrödinger said, well, the cat is both dead and alive until someone opens the box and looks at it. And this is called Schrödinger's cat. It's a famous paradox. And to this day, it's still somewhat of a problem, although we don't think necessarily that you need a conscious observer to cause the collapse of the wave function, to cause the cat to choose one or the other. It may be that any interaction with the environment, any interaction with the outside world will cause the quantum system to reduce to one state or the other. But what about a system that remains isolated? What about a system, a quantum superposition that remains isolated from the environment, from the outside world? There's nothing that tells us what will happen to it, and it can grow and stay in superposition. And this property of superposition, despite the fact that nobody really understands it very well, is used in quantum computers, which were first proposed in the 1980s and are now being built and developed very rapidly. The basic idea in quantum computing is that, well, in a classical computer, you have bits, right? Bit states, 1 or 0. And they interact and you can compute, and of course, computers are great and do all kinds of things. Now, in a quantum computer, the information can be in quantum superposition, so that you can have, in addition to 1 or 0, you can have a quantum superposition of 1 and 0. These are called quantum bits or qubits.
Okay.
So the qubits in superposition can talk to each other by non-local entanglement. And while in this state, can do incredibly efficient computation. And in fact, Peter Shor in 1994 proved that, mathematically, that if you could build a quantum computer, they would be able to solve certain problems much, much faster than conventional computers. One of these problems would be factoring large numbers into their primes, something that's very difficult for classical computers. That problem, factoring large numbers into their primes, is the basis for nearly all cryptography, bank codes, military codes throughout the world. So when governments and industry realized this, people began pouring money into building a quantum computer. So that, because if somebody had it, all the codes would be obsolete. So the race was on. And now there are other applications too. But it seemed difficult at first because the problem with the quantum computer is these superpositions are very delicate. Any interaction with the outside world will disturb them, will cause them to decohere, to lose their coherence. And then several people came up with the idea that you could actually build quantum error correction. You can build into the system an algorithm that will detect decoherence before it destroys the quantum system and correct it. So that seemed to help things along. But even so, most quantum computers are being built at very low temperature to avoid thermal oscillations, which makes it unlikely at first glance to occur in the brain because the brain is fairly warm. Nonetheless, Roger, in his book, suggested that somehow the brain performed quantum computation, that there were superpositions going on, and that this could solve the problem of non-computability and free will. And he suggested, for example, that there could be a superposition of a nerve firing and not firing, that the nerve firings were the qubits or quantum bits. I read this and I thought, boy, he's really onto something here. At a gut level, I think this quantum computing in the brain is a good idea, but I thought maybe the level of neurons firing and not firing might be too high a level. You know, maybe the microtubules that I've been studying for 20 years at the molecular level, at a much smaller level, were doing the type of quantum computation that he was looking for. So I contacted him, and we got together, and to make a long story short, we began working together to develop a model of how quantum computation could occur in the microtubules inside the neurons at a much smaller level, which would be much more conducive to quantum mechanisms, quantum computation. And microtubules seemed very well designed to be quantum computers. So that's what we did. And, but yet people would still say, well, what about the hard problem? How are you going to explain experience? So let me go back to the Greeks for a minute, because the Greeks said, or I forget which one actually, it might have been Democritus, who said that atoms had elements of psychic mental value. The idea that there's something in nature that has the raw component of conscious experience. This developed into a philosophy called panpsychism, where everything had consciousness, like this table had consciousness, every little thing had consciousness, which is not quite, which isn't really satisfying. And it evolved over the centuries and millennia, actually, into something called pan-experientialism, or pan-protopsychism, if you will. And for example, a philosopher in the early 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, came up with an idea that of pan-experientialism. It was called that later. He basically said that consciousness was a sequence of events, discrete events, occurring in a wider field of proto-conscious experience. Now, a philosopher named Abner Shimoni said that maybe Whitehead's occasions of experience were quantum state reductions, like in a quantum computer. Mm-hmm. But what could be the wider field of proto-conscious experience? Well, let's go back to what superposition really is. As I mentioned, quantum computers, which are being built today, even as we speak, in various forms. Successfully? Prototypes successfully, and they're making progress faster and faster. They're doing it with ion traps, with spin polarization, quantum dots, quantum wells, and even in silicon, with a certain way of constructing silicon. We don't have a quantum computer on desktops yet, but most people in the field are, after some pessimism, are now encouraged that they will be developed. Prototypes do exist, and you can solve certain problems with, I think, 8 qubits is the current limit. And because they're so fast, you don't need a lot of qubits, but it looks pretty good. In order for that to work, don't you have to have a level of predictability? And how do you have predictability if you don't, you know what I'm saying? If you're saying that at that level, it's a Schrodinger's cat situation, right? I mean, you can't predict it. Then how is the computer, I mean, right. There has to be predictions for it to actually work, correct? Right. Well, there's 2 answers to that. One is that they use massive parallelism. Because of the quantum superposition, you can be doing many computations, almost an infinite number of computations simultaneously, so that you can sort of average out any errors, any randomness. Or answers then. So basically, no, the answers, because the answers settle into a interference pattern, and you query that, and that's what gives you the answer. So there is some predictability. Yes, yes. It's not completely unpredictable. Correct. And the other answer to that is it depends on how the wave function collapses. Now, in quantum technology, there is randomness in the collapse, and they get around it by massive parallelism and redundancy. Mm-hmm. But in the brain, we think it's different, and that's the key point. It goes back to the idea of what exactly quantum superposition is. As I said, quantum computers use this idea of things being in 2 states at once without addressing the problem, well, how can things be in 2 states at once? Roger Penrose addressed that problem in his books, and his answer was that a particle can be in 2 places at the same time because reality itself separates. The universe at its very fundamental level actually separates. Now, there's a theory of quantum mechanics called the multiple worlds hypothesis, which states that every superposition is like Roger said, a separation in fundamental reality, but those separations branch off to form a new universe, so that every superposition leads to a new universe. So a particle in this position here will branch off and form a new universe, and if it's here, will branch off and form a new universe. We have this infinity of universes, more or less in parallel. And a lot of people believe that because mathematically it works out and it solves the problem. But it seems a little wasteful to have all these universes around. Roger said these separations occur, but they're unstable. Okay, there's some intrinsic factor in the universe that makes these separations unstable, so that after a specific time they will collapse or reduce to one state or the other. And he was able to come up with use the indeterminacy principle, one of the fundamental equations in quantum mechanics. It's a very simple equation. E equals h over t, where h is Planck's constant. E is the gravitational self-energy, the amount of superposition, the amount of mass separated from itself, the amount of separation of space-time geometry, and t is the time until collapse. Basically, they're inversely related. So a large separation would collapse very quickly. A small separation wouldn't collapse for a long time. These types of separations, unlike the randomness inherent in decoherence, would be influenced by intrinsic factors in space-time geometry itself. And this is Roger's non-computable factor. And he suggested that this non-computable factor, intrinsic features of the universe, were like Platonic values that were embedded in the universe from the Big Bang, including mathematical truth, as well as other Platonic values like ethics, aesthetic values, and so forth. Good, evil, if you will. You can carry it as far as you want. And we later added the idea that qualia, the fundamental components of experience, of consciousness, were also features or properties at this fundamental level of space-time geometry. So that a superposition, a separation in space-time geometry, which, if isolated long enough to reach its threshold for self-collapse, would choose one or the other and basically access and select a particular set of qualia, therefore giving rise to experience or consciousness. So Roger's idea was that this type of collapse, due to an objective factor, so he called it objective reduction, or OR, objective reduction, would be conscious. And if it conveyed information, would be like the consciousness we have. To go back, as I said, a small object in superposition wouldn't collapse for a long time. So a single electron, for example, if isolated in superposition, wouldn't collapse for 10 million years. Okay. And the E, the amount of superposition, would be very low. And we think E is related to the intensity of the experience. So it wouldn't be, when it had that experience after 10 million years, it wouldn't be very exciting. It'd be kind of bland. Something like Schrodinger's cat, which is a kilogram, say, because it's fairly large, would last a very short time, like 10 to the minus 37 seconds. So we wouldn't even notice it was both dead and alive. It would collapse so fast. So we tried to apply this to the brain and came up with a time t that related to functions in the brain, which are roughly hundreds of milliseconds, fractions of seconds. And we related that to microtubules and how much microtubule protein must be in superposition, how much quantum computation must be going on. And based on the number of microtubules per neuron, it comes out roughly 100,000 to 1 million neurons for every conscious moment, like that, which can happen like roughly 40 times a second. So this goes back to Whitehead's idea that consciousness is a sequence of events, roughly 40 times a second, and that each event is actually a separation and collapse in fundamental space-time geometry, and that Whitehead's wider field of proto-conscious experience is fundamental space-time geometry.
Back to what space-time geometry is, that equation, E equals h over t?
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that, or use metaphors that are in the everyday world that we might be able to follow you on?
Well, Roger asked the question, what does it mean for a particle to be in superposition?
Right.
How can something be in two places at the same time? And the answer, he said, is that the underlying reality of the particle separates. The universe, at its most basic level, splits, so that a particle over here and here is actually its underlying reality separating. Interestingly,
but isn't that kind of like saying that? I mean, isn't that potentially infinite?
Well, there's an interpretation of quantum mechanics called the multiple worlds hypothesis, which says that every superposition branches off and forms a new universe. So a superposition, a separation of particles, one goes off and forms a new universe where the particles in one location and one in the other. So going back to Schrodinger's cat, there would be a universe with the cat dead and a universe with the cat alive.
Okay.
And that's actually an interpretation that many people ascribe to, because mathematically it works and it gets around the problem of superposition. Roger kind of follows that up to a point. He says that superpositions are indeed separations in reality at the fundamental level.
That I guess I'm getting a little hung up on. Fundamental level is an implication that, I mean, people used to say that atoms would be the fundamental level, and then it's quarks, and now we're getting neutrinos and things. I mean, how can we ever be certain that we've reached the fundamental level, or even, you know, theoretically, how do we know that there's not something more fundamental than that, more fundamental than that? I mean,
right.
Given infinity, which is a mathematical prediction, how do we know when we've reached the edge of it? We can't know that we've reached the edge of it ever.
Well, if you go downward in scale, and physicists do this, well below the size of atoms, okay? And an atom actually is mostly empty when you think about it. If the nucleus of an atom were the size of a basketball, the electrons would be circling around 20 miles away.
Sure.
Most of it's empty space.
Right.
And in a vacuum, of course, there's no atoms anyway. So most of the universe is empty. If you go downward in scale, below the scale of atoms, an atom is roughly 10 to the minus 8 centimeters.
Okay.
If you go 25 orders of magnitude smaller, on the way down, everything is smooth until eventually you hit a level where all of a sudden there's coarseness, irregularity, bumpiness, information. It's kind of like falling out of an airplane from 33,000 feet. You see the ocean and it looks smooth. Mm-hmm. But as you get close, you get very close. Or if you were in a boat on the ocean, a small boat, you'd be chopping up and down. Mm-hmm. There's waves, there's coarseness, there's information. Okay. Similarly, at the basement level of the universe.
But again, that's an assumption, right? To
well,
say that
this
that's
is
the
the
basement?
level. Well, this is the level that there's quantization.
Okay.
And yes,
relative to us, for all practical purposes, relative to us, that level is where quantization occurs.
As far as we can tell, that's the basement level. Now, some people think that
from the plane that we're flying in,
yeah,
that's where or the level that we're flying from the ocean. That's or from, let's say, layers of and we've got air in between us and the water. So I mean,
smoothness, and you get down to coarseness, you get
right.
down to irregularity, you get down to information.
But below the water is also the ocean floor, which is not similar to the waves on the surface of the water. So
right.
I mean,
well, some people think that if you go down below that level, or that at that level you fall into black holes, and there's these miniature black holes everywhere, and then you pop out somewhere else. So,
okay.
But that's conjecture. Nobody knows really.
Okay.
But we do know that at that level there's coarseness, there's granularity, and this level is described various ways. It can be described by string theory. It can be described as quantum foam. It can be described as quantum gravity. It can be described as spin networks. Probably the explanation that makes the most visual sense to me is that at that level there's a kind of multidimensional or three-dimensional network, spider web of spin, where the kind of the edge of each of the web is pure spin, and that the universe ultimately is made of spin. You could say, well, what's spin? What's that made of? And you know, at some point we have to say, well, that's irreducible. We just have to say it's just there. And similarly, we say, well, the proto-conscious experience is just there. It's part of the universe at that level.
That's like, okay, so now we're into the proto-conscious experience. And I'm saying, what's the difference from, like I said, let's say that the microtubules are quantum computers, but they must be drawing from or being influenced by something that's more fundamental to themselves, and those things, or that level, must be influenced by something that's more fundamental to it, and so on infinitely, and we're basically still a result of those states collapsing at seemingly random but somewhat predictable, i.e. quantum computers. One way or another, we're getting a yes or a no out of that computer that's operating using quantum computation, right? I mean, no matter how you splice it, at some point, the screen says either yes or no when we type in our question.
No, the screen says the experience that we have, this complex image that you have right now of me and me of you, or that the viewers have looking at their screen. That's the answer. That's the solution to the quantum computations that occur in the brain. So it's much more than yes or no. But nonetheless, the question is, how do we get that? How is that the output of the quantum computation?
Well, I can see how that's the output. I'm saying that because you have enough computations, even though they're unpredictable, over time, if you have enough of them, you're going to get a tendency to give you one. You said what was it, a frequency or what was the?
Well, 40 hertz every 40 times a second is what happens in the brain. There's this frequency that seems to correlate with consciousness. So it could be that 40 times a second we have a moment of consciousness.
Okay.
As the philosopher Whitehead said, occasions of experience. So every 25 milliseconds, 40 times a second, we have a frame of consciousness, another frame, another frame, another frame. Now consciousness seems continuous to us. We don't notice that we're not conscious in between because we're not conscious.
Sure.
And like a movie seems continuous rather than being herky-jerky because, you know.
Well, we can throw all the in-betweens away. All we need is one frame of awareness,
Right.
of consciousness, and then we know that for all practical purposes, it exists. And so.
And maybe that's all that exists. But that's another story.
Okay. But I guess what I'm having problems with is no matter, even if we agree that the microtube, that we have quantum computations occurring right now in our heads, all right, so it's not that it can occur, temperature, whatever, our limited understanding of this whole new field, you know, the quantum field that we've only really just started talking about like 70 years ago. So we're still too early to really have built enough theories and instruments and measurement techniques, devices, methods to really be able to say that something isn't possible in it yet.
Well, hang on a second, Greg, because quantum theory makes certain predictions, and out to like, I forget, 25 decimal points that have been verified over and over and over again. Quantum theory is actually very, very precise. The indeterminacy comes in certain randomness inherent in quantum theory.
Okay.
But when the predictions that are made are very, very accurate. Now the thing about consciousness and the collapse that we think occurs in consciousness, it's a different type of collapse than the randomness that we normally think of in terms of quantum indeterminacy.
Oh, so even though, so basically quantum computers are irrelevant because they're not really a metaphor for what is the method that it's actually occurring in our brains.
Correct.
With microtubules.
Right. They are up to a point in that they're quantum computations, there's superpositions, and there's this interaction among qubits. The difference is how the collapse or reduction occurs. In a quantum computer, the computation goes along and finishes, and then somebody opens the door and looks at it. Okay, and there's some randomness introduced, but because you've done it in parallel, that doesn't matter, and you get the solution.
So it's kind of like if I open the box enough times,
something like that.
The cat was dead, 99 times, and it was alive 97 times. So it's dead, basically.
Roughly speaking.
Okay.
Whereas in consciousness, it's a self-collapse. The superposition goes on until it reaches this threshold, and it's of objective reduction, an objective threshold. And that objective threshold for self-collapse is due to the fact that it's an actual separation in fundamental space-time geometry, as Roger predicted, and there's an instability there. So if you have a separation in the fundamental level, the Planck scale that I was talking about before, there's some resiliency there. It's kind of like being in a bubble bath. You know how the little bubbles pop because they can only last so long? So you have these separations and they collapse. And when they do that, those are not random. Those are not.
So when the bubble gets, if a bubble tries to get too much bigger than the surrounding bubbles, it pops. Basically.
Yeah, it's not this. Yeah, whether it's surrounding bubbles or it's its own intrinsic instability, it collapses
Something
to one or the other.
The amount of mass available to.
The amount of separation. You can think of it as the size of the bubble.
But I mean, if you had enough soap, then you could have the size of the bubble is directly related to the drop of the soap that you begin, or the bubble material that you begin with, right? I mean, when we were kids and we would take a big loop and put it in the stuff and blow a bubble, we got a big one because it was starting with a lot more material. Right?
Right, but I think the opposite in that, in this case, the larger the bubble, the faster it's going to collapse. The smaller the bubble can go on for a long time. Maybe that happens.
Doesn't it depend on the density or the available mass then, is what I'm saying?
It depends on the amount of separation. And it depends on how far apart.
But I mean, the amount of separation has to do with the amount of available mass to hold that separation stable. Right?
Well, it depends how you look at separation. For example, let's say we're talking about a protein, a microtubule subunit separating from itself, okay, as the qubit, as the quantum bit. Okay. Is that the protein separating from itself? Is it the amino acids in that protein separating from themselves? Is it the atoms in that protein separating? Is it the protons, neutrons, electrons? Is it the atomic nucleus? You can
Gotcha.
look at it very many.
So even the MAP2, for instance, that Nancy Wolfe talks about, which is the thing that lets go of the microtubule for a split second or whatever else, that allows it to be in a quantum state where it does not have any interference from the surrounding components of the neuron, say.
Yeah, when the MAP2, in Nancy's work, she showed that when certain neurons are activated, the MAP2s that normally connect the microtubules from the membrane detach. The microtubules go into isolation, therefore they go into a quantum state.
Because they don't have the interference from the
They
surrounding...
don't have the environment causing decoherence, so they're allowed to go into a quantum superposition. And they go on until they reach this threshold for collapse. They have their conscious moment, and then they reconnect to communicate the results to the outside world. But there are also maps in between the microtubules that act to tune the quantum oscillations, kind of like frets on a guitar or some kind of musical instrument, which is why we call them orchestrators. They orchestrate the quantum oscillations. So,
hold on one second. What's doing the orchestration? The MAP2, the protein?
Yeah, not the MAP2s coming in from the outside, but in the microtubules in isolation, in a bundle.
Inside of it, there is MAP2
They're
as
MAP2,
well.
yeah, connecting them, and they act kind of like frets on a guitar, or corresponding device in a piano or a musical instrument to tune the quantum oscillations, so that the quantum computations can have some resonance in this bundle of microtubules. So that provides feedback also. The problem with quantum computing is that you need to be isolated from the outside world, but you also need to have input and output. We think this happens by alternating phases of input-output, like roughly 25 milliseconds, 40 times a second. So you have a phase of communication, input-output. In the classical world, and then the maps detach. You have buildup of the quantum computation in the microtubules, collapse, a moment of consciousness. You communicate the results, more input, then you initiate the quantum. So you repeat the cycle of classical, quantum, having a conscious moment, and then communicate the results, input into the quantum system, build up the quantum, over and over and over again, 40 times a second.
So inside the microtubule, basically, let's say once it's isolated, then and isolated is that it doesn't have, so once the MAP2 is connected to it, it's operating at a certain frequency, you said, which was when we study the brain, we're looking at a general frequency, right? That the brain's operating at.
40 hertz is
40 hertz.
is a common one that seems to be pretty important. So
okay, so let's say that everything around the microtubule is operating at 40 hertz.
Let's say the whole brain's operating at 40 hertz.
But when the microtubules disconnect, the MAP2 lets go of it, then the microtubule can operate at non-40 hertz. It can operate at, what do you say, 25 or?
Well, 25 milliseconds. No, that's the same as 40 hertz. 25 milliseconds times 40 is 1 second.
Okay.
So when I say 25 milliseconds, I'm talking about the phase of the quantum computation building up and then collapsing. But the quantum oscillations themselves are much, much faster, 10 to the 13 hertz or something like that.
Okay, so that occurs within the microtubule.
Right.
And so it's operating at this extremely high frequency.
In the quantum state, in the quantum phase.
When it's in the quantum phase.
Right, and it's communicating non-locally with all the other quantum bits in the microtubules, and that neuron and other neurons connected through gap junctions, and presumably throughout the brain, so that you can have this fairly large number of tubulins involved, so that it can reach threshold fairly quickly.
Why would the neurons need to be connected by axons and dendrites if they were communicating already via the microtubules? I mean, we had walkie-talkies in different rooms. Why would we also need a string with 2 cups on the end of it? I mean,
well, axons and dendrites are noisy. So you have the problem of decoherence and thermal noise. If you try to get, it could be that, but I think if you try to get the quantum coherence to jump from one neuron to another across a synapse, you'd have to interact with the environment, the synapse being the part of the environment.
But did you just say that the microns communicate with each other, neuron to neuron?
Well, we think it's through a different type of synapse called a gap junction. A gap junction is kind of a window between cells, where actually the inside of one is literally connected to the inside of another. It's like opening a door. So a neuron connected to another neuron by a gap junction, this window or porthole, is really one big neuron.
It's almost like, okay, we're in opposite rooms, but it has a sheet of glass in between it, double pane glass. We can see each other, so I can go like this, but only if everybody steps out of my way, then I go like this and you can see me doing it.
Or better yet, you just open the glass and it's one room. So that, therefore, a quantum state would actually spread from one. basically you want one inside and one outside. So if you connect a bunch of neurons by these gap junctions into sort of a hyperneuron, you can have a complex of neurons that basically have one inside and one outside. And inside that hyperneuron is where the quantum state can develop fairly quickly because you have enough microtubules, enough tubulin in superposition to reach threshold quickly. Because you need a fairly large amount to reach it quickly, otherwise it would take a long time, and then you'd have decoherence problems. Plus you want it to happen fairly quickly so you can have the advantage of using it in real time and to do things that we need to do.
I got to back a little bit here. You got the two microtubules, they enter quantum state at the same time, they're communicating with each other. But you're saying you still need a physical thing like an axon dendrite connecting the two neurons. Why? Because I mean, again, if they're communicating with each other, then why do we need axons and dendrites
to communicate the results to the outside world and to communicate the outside world
but why do we
to
need
the quantum state?
That's fine, but why do we need them between neurons?
Gap junctions. Well, for the quantum state, we need gap junctions. Gap junctions are different type of synapse.
No, I agree with you, I mean, I understand that, but then why do the neurons between themselves need axons and neurons at all?
For classical processing, because not everything the brain does is conscious. In fact, most of what the brain does is not conscious.
So basically, we've got multiple types of computation occurring
right.
within the neurons and between neurons. We've got computational or quantum computations going on. We also have classic computation.
Right.
And the axons and dendrites are maintaining those classical ones. The microtubules are running the quantum computations. Well,
the microtubules may be involved in a lot of things, but only. I mean, consciousness is kind of like the tip of an iceberg, okay? Most of what the brain does is non-conscious. And in fact, if you anesthetize patients and look at their EEG, there's a lot of electrical activity going on when consciousness isn't there. So most of what the brain does is non-conscious. Then there's the issue of subconscious or preconscious, and consciousness is just kind of this tip of an iceberg. So there's probably at any one time, there's only, let's say, 1 million neurons out of 10 billion that are involved in consciousness. But those particular million might shift around depending on the connections of the gap junctions. Right. So we need the synapses and axons, dendrites, classical processing to, number one, bring the environment, from our senses into the system, and number two, to communicate the results of the quantum computation conscious moments to the outside world. So if we make a conscious decision to do something, the results of that are communicated. And we think most of this is happening in the dendrites, to the axon hillock to cause the axon to fire, which eventually tells our muscles to move or for us to do things. Right. So we need all this classical processing to support the quantum computations that are important for consciousness.
So the quantum computations decide what to do, but they still need to, at some point, set off a chain of classical reactions in order for me to lift my hand in the air.
Right, and they also need that same type of classical information to bring the information to it.
Right, okay, so that's our input and our output, essentially.
Right, exactly.
All right, back to the problem with, well, I mean, this is a huge assumption to say that, well, it's at a certain point there we reach the fundamental layer of the universe, and basically the cat's dead, the cat's not dead, are two different universes, but on such a fundamental level that we'll never be able to observe them directly. But the result of them is such that that's the assumption, right?
The assumption is that.
Then aren't those universes generating our reality? I mean,
there's only one universe, okay? The fundamental level is the universe. Yeah, it's way, way down there, but it's everywhere, wherever you go. And basically, Einstein equated mass and curvature in space-time. So that a mass causes curvature in space-time, and you can also look at it the other way around. The curvature is mass in space-time. So really, space-time geometry at this fundamental level is all there is. And spin, mass, charge, consciousness, everything derives from that. So an atom is, you could think of it as just a dense curvature of space-time geometry. And at that fundamental level, okay, mass is one output of it, but also embedded at that level is information. For example, the proto-conscious experience that philosophers call qualia, maybe things like redness or sadness, or very simple. It's kind of like a painter has a palette with fundamental colors on it. Okay, and he or she takes a brush and picks a little of that and puts it here, a little of that, puts it there, and makes the Mona Lisa. Okay, from these fundamental components. The fundamental components of our conscious experience, qualia, if you will, or proto-conscious qualia, are embedded at the fundamental level of the universe at the Planck scale.
Someone could argue that you could separate the color purple into red and blue, even though the color purple's on that palette and it looks fundamental to us. If we were the size of an atom in that paint,
right.
we would say, hey, there's some, I'm red and you're blue. But
okay, well,
together
maybe
we make purple out there, but
yeah.
in here, we're different.
Well, maybe you only have red, blue there, and the rest is done at a higher level. Or maybe it's even more fundamental than that. Maybe color isn't even a good example because it's a specific wavelength of light. Mm-hmm. But something that makes up our experience is down at that level. When you put it all together gives us this, feelings, qualia, if you will. When you put it all together, gives us the complex experience that we have. So our conscious experience, each frame, 40 times a second, is kind of like the Mona Lisa. Of course, it's changing due to the inputs and due to our conscious processes, quantum computations and microtubules, if we're correct, selecting particular sets of qualia at this fundamental level. So basically consciousness...
Then we're the painter. I mean, we're the one at 40, very, very fast,
well, who's we?
Almost blurry. I mean, me, for instance.
But
I'm the one picking the colors and making the Mona Lisa, are I not?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. But you are the process, actually. It's not you making it. It's you're actually self-assembling those proto-conscious qualia and putting them together to make the frame.
And that's happening. I mean, then the microtubule is conscious. For all intents and purposes, it's conscious.
Well, not one microtubule. You need this whole collapse is conscious. It's a process of fundamental space-time geometry.
Well, you need that much to get to our level of consciousness, right? But I mean, isn't it happening then as well on the microtubule level? Isn't it conscious at least? I mean, it's making a decision, right? The microtubule is it's producing a quantum computation, and then the aggregate of all of those computations is what is producing our sensation, our
well, it's
experience, right?
It's kind of an all or none phenomenon, in that objective because of this threshold phenomenon. You only have collapse when you reach threshold. If you decohere before, that's not conscious. You have to reach this threshold.
So one microtubule cannot reach that threshold, not produce that threshold.
Only if it was isolated for years.
Okay, right. But in the splits in the microsecond that it does create a thought.
You need billions. Or you need actually I can tell you how many you need for roughly we calculated for a 40 hertz. You need something like 10 to the 10th tubulins. Tubulins being the protein subunits of microtubules, so that's 10 billion tubulins per conscious event.
So within each tubulin, there's an actual quantum. Is the tubulin
No, the whole
itself?
thing is one. Is kind of like one.
So the individual tubulin never is devoid of the interference to be able to do its own computation?
It would have to be isolated for years for just one. But if you put them all together, you reach you increase the E, you increase the amount of superposition, so you reach threshold fairly quickly. So you can reach it within 25 milliseconds. If you left one tubulin by itself, it would take 10 years or something like that, and then it would be a very low intensity experience, because the E is also related to the intensity of the experience. So, for example, if you're excited, if somebody scares you or enchants you or something like that, the quantum superposition builds up more quickly. Okay, so
why does our brain marshal
more inputs, and you just reach you get excited and you reach threshold more quickly, so that the height and then you reach collapse, and then you do it again and again. So two things happen: the intensity is greater, and you have more events per time. So you have more intense experience, and they're happening more frequently.
Do we need more microtubulins to
Yes.
be active in that then?
Yes.
So basically more of our brain is active
Yes.
during that excitement moment.
Exactly.
And so we have more computers basically marshaled to solve the fight or flee equation.
Yeah. Or enchantment or whatever it is, something good, hopefully.
Right.
And in fact, plus you're having more events per time, which means that your inner time is faster and the outer world is slower.
Do quantum computers operate at different speeds though? At different times? Don't they always operate at the same?
Well, technological quantum computers have a clock time, and the microtubules within those conscious events may have the same fast 10 to the 13th second per second clock time, but they're going to reach threshold quicker, so the conscious events are going to be more intense and happen more often.
How do they reach threshold quicker though, unless they're using, I mean, each?
Because there's more of them. So
I'm just going to the singular microtubulin. How does it produce more computations and less computations when it's in the quantum state, it should be producing the same.
Because there are more of them.
No, but I said, okay, but
More,
you also said
more
that,
tubulins.
you said that, right, the brain's using more of its neurons.
And more
for this-
microtubules.
Well, because each neuron
Right.
has microtubules within
Right.
it. So if it uses more neurons, it's also using more microtubules.
Right.
But you said also that each one is producing computations faster.
No, because you have more, you're going to reach threshold
Okay,
faster.
so each individual one of them is
It's
still producing the same amount,
Right.
whether I'm sleeping, awake, or whatever. It's producing.
Well, if it's going into it may not be going into quantum superposition when you're sleeping.
It only goes into a quantum state when it has external stimuli that drives it into that quantum state.
Yes, although dreaming may also occur. I think dreaming in the subconscious is quantum superposition. In fact, in this model, before collapse, what do you have? You have quantum superposition. That's the preconscious, which may be the subconscious, okay? Freudian subconscious or the dream state or something like that. And for example, dreaming is very much, in some ways, like quantum superposition. You have multiple possibilities coexisting. You have deep connections. You have distortions of reality. You have time, funny things with time. You have all things that are very, and in fact, if you look at paintings that certain artists do that seem to come from the subconscious, you have the same sort of surreal, subconscious, dreamlike qualities that are similar, I think anyway, to quantum superposition of distorted reality, multiple possibilities, interconnectedness, and so forth. So maybe the subconscious or the preconscious is really quantum superposition. And when it reaches collapse, you have a conscious moment. But you can also get, elements of the subconscious out non-consciously in various ways.
Were there experiences that you can talk about that
No.
were sort of central drivers that provided the motivation for you to get into this as in-depth as you have? Or could you even give us some general, was it I was meditating and I had a transcendental experience that led me to believe that there's something far more than what we have here and this simplistic mechanistic level, or whatever it was. Can you give us either general or semi-specific?
Right. I had some very powerful, intense, introspective experiences when I was younger that made me really wonder what was going on, what I was and what I was doing here and what everything was. And when I found myself in medical school, I was studying cell division under the microscope, and I saw these microtubules pulling chromosomes apart, and I wondered how they knew what to do. And I got this idea that whatever was in my consciousness was also occurring down there. And at that time, it was discovered that these same structures were also found in neurons, because prior to that, the fixative agent in electron microscopy had been dissolving them for many, many years. So when I discovered that these structures were in all cells, including neurons, I began to think that they were important for consciousness. But I was driven by my own personal intense curiosity from my experiences earlier.
Basic human question. I mean, would the general audience member be able to identify with? I mean, everybody seems to have the same question: what's the meaning of life, and me, and what's going to happen to me when I die? Where did I come from?
Right.
So I mean, it's that, but it was amplified by experiences that basically, and you happen to be at the right place at the right time. You were studying these other phenomena, and your age and everything else. Basically, you dug in, and so you've been on that course, and you're there today. And, okay.
My conclusion after all this is that consciousness is a self-organizing process at this fundamental level of the universe, that we are really the universe. We're a process occurring at this basic level. So we're connected to the universe, and we're also connected to each other because the universe has this property of non-locality. Everything's connected to everything. So it's kind of a spiritual thing because basically we are a fundamental level of the universe. And at that level, there's all kinds of information, wisdom, if you will. The Buddhist universal mind, the Jungian collective unconscious, Platonic values, things in the Kabbalah about wisdom and light. Various religions and spiritual quests all have this idea of some greater universal truth, wisdom, connectedness, spirituality, call it God, call it what you will, that's part of the universe. And I think that the physics of it take us down to this fundamental level. And Penrose's work describes how this information can be there. And taken with quantum physics tells us how we can be connected to this level and how we can be connected to the universe and to each other. and that the universe is in some sense alive and in some sense proto-conscious, really, and has been probably since the Big Bang.
Of those experiences that you had that were sort of the driving motivators that gave you the intent and the intensity to maintain this pursuit, where many probably have just given up and gone off and you know, designed video cameras or something far, far simpler. I mean, what were some of those events, if you could even tell us any of them?
Well, I kind of kept to my my quest because I was in a field, anesthesiology, which allowed me to study consciousness. And you know, I'm a clinical anesthesiologist, so every day I put my patients to sleep, and I still wonder, you know, where do they go?
Okay.
And that makes me wonder, why are they there in the first place, and what consciousness really is. And when they wake up and they're talking to me, you know, even though it's routine, it's also still marvelous. And I think actually anesthesia is one of the great inventions of the last 1,000 years when you think about it. And what anesthetics do, what the gases do anyway, is get into the brain and work by very delicate quantum mechanical forces, suggesting that consciousness itself is a quantum process. So that allowed me to study this while pursuing an academic career and earning a living as an anesthesiologist. So I was fortunate in that, and plus the fact that in doing it this way, I didn't have to follow traditional paths. I didn't have to be cubbyholed so I could get grants, so I could be in any discipline, so I could get approval from people by doing the predictable type of thing. I could be a maverick and follow what intuitively I thought was the right thing. And I'm very fortunate for that. Academic freedom is a great thing, and it's allowed me to come to this point. And you know, I get criticized a lot because it's a radical idea. I'm a maverick, Roger's a maverick. But you know, I think it's far greater to be criticized than ignored, and the fact that we annoy people who have conventional approaches is actually kind of cool.
Well, I think that, you know, the general audience is very happy that someone's willing to, you know, have the courage to move forward, you know, without trying to protect themselves so much that they don't move anywhere. You know, I think that generally, maybe not in the scientific community where there's lots of prestige to be maintained and funding and you know, but everyone else is really happy when there's a major breakthrough. When the Wright brothers create an airplane, we're all like, you know, geez, sorry that they had to go through so much hell from that particular community, but you know, the result is of benefit to everyone, and so you've got a lot of supporters, I think.
Well, thank you.
In the world, in the wide world. But what about people with near-death experiences that claim to go into the white light? Do you think that they're going into that, meaning the palette in fact does not have different color paints, it just has this big, it's just a big bucket of white, and they go in, and this is in fact where all the colors are? I mean, is that, you think, something that might, what do you think, what's your explanation for what happens to them?
There have been several studies recently about near-death experiences in Europe, and those descriptions are very repetitive. Patients
People do say the
that.
same.
And they also, at least occasionally, say that they float out of their body and can describe things from above, and may float out to the waiting room and have a sense of calm, and they may visit you know, their deceased relatives and this sort of thing. And my explanation for that is that consciousness is actually a process in fundamental space-time geometry. Okay, it's at the very basic level of the universe. Now, normally it's in the space-time geometry, you know, between our ears, in the microtubules in our neurons. But when they stop working, when the metabolic drive, the blood flow, the oxygen is stopped, and the acid builds up, and the coherent pumping of the microtubules driving the quantum coherence stops, the quantum information isn't lost. It just kind of leaks out to the universe at large in space-time geometry. It's still there.
So when clinical death occurs, no neurons are firing, nothing's happening.
Right.
And yet, when the person comes back from that, somehow their memories are maintained, everything's still there, they're still themselves.
Well, the near-death experience is curious for several reasons, because patients report awareness that seems to be occurring when their brain's not working.
Right.
And clinically, doctors would say it's impossible because, you know, the brain's not functioning. They can't be having awareness at that time.
Which proves then that consciousness is not just occurring on the neuron level, or the, you know, the synaptic level that we're aware of, the classical synaptic level.
Well, I think it proves that, but you know, skeptics come up with different types of explanations. But what I think happens, as I said, is that the quantum information leaks out into the space-time geometry at large. You may think that it's going to dissipate and spread out and be lost, but because of quantum entanglement, it tends to stay together, at least for a while, and can sort of hover. And when the body, you know, when the patient is resuscitated and the blood flow is resumed, and if too much damage hasn't been done, it resumes, returns to the brain. and which raises the question of what happens if the patient is not revived. Is that the soul? Does it go off indefinitely into the universe? And maybe it does.
Don't those experiences, though, have a sort of progressive quality, so that it's, you know, the people who, I don't know if it's been measured in the hospital room during clinical death, how long they've been gone, for instance, but there's some that say they've gone all the way to the white light, for instance, where it was just nothing but white light, versus those that were in, you know, I saw my body still, I was aware of the room and things. I mean, do you think that there's a slow dissolution into, because people have said they've gone into white light, for instance, and then they come back. What's in the white light state, where there's nothing, there's no objects, there's no computation, there's nothing there, and yet they're aware of it, and they say it's like extraordinarily euphoric and incredible.
A sense of calm, a sense of that everything is okay, and they're not frightened. And when people try to explain this by delusions due to lack of oxygen, that doesn't jive, because when patients are short of oxygen, they get confused and agitated. And these patients have just the opposite reaction. They're very serene and calm. And when they come back, they say it was actually, it wasn't scary at all. It was, most of the time, not all the time, that it was very calm and reassuring. And
well, during clinical death, they're not confused and agitated. They're clinically dead, right? I mean, there's
right, but I mean, if patients get hypoxic, that is, suffer lack of oxygen,
okay,
before while they're still there, they're confused and agitated.
Okay.
So there's some people who try to explain these near-death experiences by saying, well, lack of oxygen causes this hallucination of sense of calmness, but that doesn't really fit. Besides which, they describe things that occur when they are gone, and in some cases, things that they couldn't have known otherwise. In some cases, things that occur out in the waiting room. So there's a lot of very, at least anecdotal, bizarre things that can't be explained by conventional explanations. And I think, there's a reasonable possibility that it's that consciousness being a process in fundamental space-time geometry. I know I keep saying that like a broken record, but that's the universe. That's where we live. That's all there is, really. And the consciousness is a self-organizing process at that level, and it goes out to the universe at large, but yet hangs together somehow because of this quantum entanglement. So it gives a possibility that there is a soul or a spirit after death.
Although that's where we live, we actually, I mean, wouldn't it behoove us to go, wouldn't we prefer in a way to go to, so we became nothing but a field of microtubules or quantum computers, versus having, mass and things that we have to worry about feeding and clothing and housing and things, I mean, and moving about in this very, a very friction-full, level here. I mean,
yeah, well,
why would we, if it's all...
Well, maybe that's what happens to us. That's where we go when
that
die.
occurs. So all that's left then is the quantum computers, and then...
Quantum information, yeah, quantum. In fact, the Kabbalah is another approach to this, and the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, if you will, says that we live in a world of the 1% world of aggravation, basically. Things are kind of rough, frictionful, as you said. And on the other side, and then there's a curtain on the other side, there's wisdom and light and enlightenment. And there's a curtain in between, and consciousness actually dances on the edge between the 1% world of aggravation, I call it, and the 99% world of wisdom and light. You might say, well, if the quantum world is very small, yet how can it be the 99% world? If you go down in scale, you're getting smaller, but the amount of information is vast. If you go down to these quantum gravity level of spin networks, for example, to the actual pixels of consciousness, or pixels of the universe, there's something like 10 to the 107th in the volume of our brain. So the amount of information is so vast, it's just mind-boggling. So the 99% world could indeed be this small quantum world, but it's everywhere, so it's really, really vast. And maybe that's where we go,
Do you think then that we always experience, okay, say that's where we go, is it also assumed that that's where we come from? And if so, why do we come here in the first place?
To get to the other side.
Wait, but didn't we come from
maybe
behind the curtain?
It could be.
We stepped out on stage.
It could be. I mean, if you believe in reincarnation and so forth, that's quite possible that those things happen. I mean,
then why do we ever step through the curtain to this 1%? I mean, it seems so limiting. Why would we come here?
I don't know, it's kind of fun.
Were we pushed here? Or
I don't know. I mean, why not? I mean, but it could be. I think biology actually evolved and developed to house and access consciousness, and to take it from maybe this sort of distributed non-local form into concentrated form for a while, and then we go back there. And
But why? I mean, what would be the motive, or I mean, is that just a natural occurrence? That's just the nature of the universe.
Could be. You know, a friend of mine, Paola Zizi, is an astrophysicist in Italy, and she has this theory. Right after the Big Bang, the universe underwent this very, very rapid inflation, like in a tiny fraction of a second. It just expanded very, very fast, and then it reached its threshold, and then since then it's been expanding very, very slowly. This is called period of inflation. And she has theorized that this end of inflation, the reason that the inflation stopped and the expansion has been very, very slow, was that before that everything was in superposition. There were multiple universes, tiny universes, but expanding very rapidly. And at that moment, the Penrose objective reduction was met, and the multiple worlds collapsed to one. And since then, it's been expanding fairly slowly.
They collapsed, meaning they basically dissolved.
No. It reduced from multiple possibilities to one. One universe was chosen. Okay. And by Penrose definition, that is a conscious moment. So she says that at that moment, shortly after the Big Bang, the universe had a cosmic conscious experience.
Wouldn't it still be conscious then?
Maybe. Or at least proto-conscious, because I think that at this fundamental level, at least anything in superposition has the potential to be conscious. It may not have a lot of information, so it may not be conscious in the sense that we're conscious, but potentially at least there could be some kind of pure consciousness with or without information. She calls it, by the way, her theory is called the Big Wow, because at this moment the universe had this cosmic conscious experience right after the Big Bang.
They say that the universe is basically, as it expands, if it keeps going at its current speed, trajectory, whatever, it's going to essentially, we're looking at a big ocean of radiation about, I don't know how many billion years from now, 100 billion or whatever. They say it's sort of like the way the ocean eventually breaks down anything that's like, lost ships or whatever, that eventually it dissolves it. That means it'll dissolve our galaxy and solar system and us, right, into nothing but radiation. What happens then?
Well, I don't know. I mean, who knows? Nobody knows for sure. But the other thing about this is that this funny thing about time going backwards. So, we can always maybe go backwards in time. Who knows?
Great. Well, it's a lot to ponder. Thank you
Yes, it
very
is.
much.
You're welcome, Greg. My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks a lot.